Hi, this is George Alger for today's segment of OurVentura.com. And today I have a guest, Craig Shields, who's the author of Renewable Energy, Facts and Fantasies, best-selling book on Amazon. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, George. Good to be here.
So today we're going to be talking about energy storage, and it seems like the name would be quite intuitive, and yet why don't we just start off by defining what energy storage actually means?
Well, when energy is created, in other words, generated through whatever means, it's either used there on the spot, or it's stored someplace and somehow, or it's gotten rid of. So this is a concept by which you take energy and you keep it for when you need it.
Batteries being a classic example
Exactly.
of that. Okay, so now we're talking about renewable energy and storing energy on a large scale. I mean, I think in terms of municipal energy facilities.
Right.
And so how would they normally store energy?
Well, generally they don't, and that's the problem. That's the challenge of introducing renewable energies onto the grid. So, for instance, if you have a coal-fired power plant, it's running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now you can scale them up and down slightly, but generally a lot of the energy that is being generated with coal-fired power plants in the middle of the night is simply wasted. It's simply dumped back to ground.
No kidding.
Yes, exactly. Nuclear as well.
Wow. So the concept of even introducing energy storage on a big scale it's also new in terms of the renewable energy industry.
Yes, people have been contemplating how we're going to do this for some time. And to be honest with you, in the United States, it doesn't really matter a heck of a lot at this particular point. We have less than 2% penetration of renewables. The totality of all our photovoltaics and wind and so forth is less than 2% of our total energy consumption. So at this point, it's not a big deal, but it's starting to be. So we're deploying more wind as an example, and in certain parts of the country, there's curtailment. They tell them, we do not put energy on the grid in the middle of the night, which, by the way, is when the wind is blowing hardest. So it's starting to become an issue.
Okay, now you mentioned photovoltaics.
Right.
Can you just define that?
Well, so solar panels, in other words, the process by which we take the sun's energy, the incident, what are called photons, the little particles of light, hitting a surface and creating energy, electricity from that.
Okay. All right, so in terms of energy storage, even if we weren't speaking about renewable energy itself or various sources of renewable energy, is it not important to introduce energy storage into the existing infrastructure?
I would say that it's less important. It would be great if we, for instance, we do have peak loads in the middle of the afternoon and the early evening because that's when air conditioners come on, people come home from work, so forth and so on. So we have peak loads. So the degree to which we wouldn't have to build more power plants if we could shave those peaks. In other words, if we could store energy at night and put it back on the grid in the middle of the day, that would be good. But it's essential when you get penetration of renewables that goes over into the teens, and ultimately, of course, we want all of this stuff to be renewable energy, and at which point it's going to be fantastically important to come up with utility-scale solutions for storage.
Okay, so now if we bring the concept of renewable energy to individuals, and now we have to speak about energy storage, is that true?
Well, if by that you mean, so an individual guy who puts solar panels on his roof or a wind generator out in his field or something like that, not necessarily. It's important if the guy's not on the grid, but most of the people that I think that you're talking about are people who live in Ventura, for instance, are 100% on the grid. So you can simply, if the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining, you can power your refrigerator or whatever it is from the grid.
Okay. Well, then what are the biggest challenges in terms of energy storage?
Well, it's an amazing subject when you think about it, because when you think that the city of Ventura, I don't know, there are 100,000 people here, would you say?
Yeah.
Okay, so you can imagine the amount of energy that needs to be served up to power all the needs of those 100,000 people, and say tens of who live in say 30,000 homes or so forth. You also have electric vehicles coming on the line, so that's going to require even more energy. So the issue then becomes, well, how do you do that? So if you have this wind farm generating fantastic amounts of power in the middle of the night, how are you going to store that to be used during the day. Now, there are various methods that are being talked about on this thing. One of them is pumped hydro. Okay, so you can imagine that if you have a lake at a certain elevation, and we've had hydroelectric dams for almost a century at this point. So you have a lake at a certain elevation, you take the water out of that elevation to a lower elevation, and you extract the energy out of that. That's a wonderful technology. Now, what can you do with it once it's at the bottom? Well, if you've got more energy, you can pump it back to the top. Okay, that's called pumped hydro. That is good. It's good in certain places. It's much better in certain places than others when you think about it. Obviously, if you don't have a natural change of elevation, you have to create an artificial one. You have to dig a huge ditch and so forth. But that pumped hydro is certainly one of these.
Are there any environmental challenges relative to that?
I'm sure there are. I'm sure the environmental impact reports that you have to get to do something like that. When I had my horse farm, I'm sure you remember, I could not. We had a natural water course running through 14 acres of the place, the so-called ravine. I couldn't get a permit to grow daisies in that thing without getting an environmental impact report. So I'm sure that I don't know the details on this thing, but I'm sure the answer is yes.
All right. But it is not an unusually known problem or issue.
Well, not so much there. But other kinds of energy storage obviously have fantastically different and more difficult impact in terms of environment. I'll give you a good example is compressed air. So what people are talking about, and there are two examples of this in the world, is taking caverns and compressing air in them. So you take the energy that would have been wasted or that you could have used to pump water upstairs, okay, and instead of doing that, you use it to compress air. And then you decompress, to extract the energy, you simply decompress it, kind of like blowing up a balloon and then releasing it. But as you can imagine, there's leakage. But there are solutions for that. You use caverns that were formerly used for natural gas. So there are all manner of complications on this thing, one of which is, and I just learned this the other day, you think of compressed air as being, the rate at which I blow up a balloon is kind of, I can blow it up quickly or slowly, and it's no big deal to my lungs. Well, guess what? When you do this on a big scale, the efficiency with which that energy is stored and then released is is very well correlated to the actual configuration of the cavern. So what does this thing look like underneath? Is it long and skinny or round? And if you don't do this exactly according to the configuration of the cavern, you get fantastic losses in terms of efficiency.
Okay. Now, I know you're involved with some other types of energy storage opportunities. You want to speak to that?
Well, sure. A lot of my involvement in this industry has to do with electric transportation. So this is obviously this is an even bigger deal when you think about electric transportation, because there it's definitely you don't have another solution than storage. You can't plug in your car and drive it at the same time. So, of course, the kind of plug hybrid is a kind of workaround for that. So you have an onboard generator and so forth. But ultimately, on a pure EV, when we get to pure EVs, like the Nissan Leaf as an example, this becomes extremely important. So how do you have inexpensive, energy-dense battery solutions that get the job done on this? So that's part of the reason to do this, is to really explore battery chemistries. There are hundreds and hundreds of different approaches of this, all of which are being worked on at the same time. You go to one of these battery conventions, and I'll tell you what, you're lost in about 2 seconds. Even the PhDs reading these other papers are kind of falling asleep. I was watching some of these people at the IEEE show in Boston a couple of months ago. I was having trouble following this, of course, but even the people with PhD after their name are a little challenged with this. So lots of different solutions on this. And batteries, some people are talking about using batteries at the utility scale level, which I don't think will ever happen. You can imagine how, if we're paying, $500 or $600 a kilowatt hour for a lithium-ion battery on your, Nissan Leaf or whatever, you can imagine you want to store gigawatt hours of energy in batteries. I don't think so. Even though there are people talking about this, I don't see the merit.
Well, my familiarity with batteries is through more traditional batteries that we'd use in the home. And it seems to me that over the decades, I've seen incremental improvements in batteries. Is there any breakthroughs on the horizon?
I don't believe so. And
Okay.
the reason I don't believe so, and it's not because I've done independent research on this thing, but when I go, that's a good question, and it's one I ask all the time when I'm at these conferences. What does this thing look like, 5 or 10 years hence? There's certainly the decrease in cost and nominal, we have Moore's law, the idea that technologies improve exponentially over time. The question is, what is the exponent? So what people tell me is that there really is no silver bullet on this thing. We will see that exponential increase, but the exponent isn't that big. So we will see better range. In other words, we will get to the point Stephen Chu, the Secretary of Energy of the United States, said just the other day that he sees by 2020 we'll be easily able to have the range to drive from here, where he was in Washington, D.C. I was sitting right next to him. To Boston. And he goes, anybody who wants to drive any farther than Boston in a day is, a whack job anyway. My words, not his. But he says that will handle this situation nicely during a time at which the cost per kilowatt hour is going to come down to a couple $100, and then everybody will be happy. But he sees this thing happening between now and the year 2020, so that's pretty good.
All right. Well, we're running down to the last segment of the show here. What would you like to summarize as something that would be, something you would look forward to, or something you see as the most prevalent opportunity in terms of energy storage? Well,
here's something that I haven't mentioned, and I'll you just shut me up when you've run out of time on this thing, but I do want to mention synthetic fuels, because there is a calculus, even though there has been disappointment associated with this thing starting in the 70s when we had the first oil embargo and we dumped billions of dollars into this subject. There are people who have recently begun to solve it in ways that I find very credible. The issue isn't can you do it. The issue is can you do it cost effectively, or the losses, the thermodynamic losses associated with this thing so great that it's just horrifically expensive. And there's a company that my organization, 2 Green Energy, is working for called Wind Fuels, run by a guy by the name of Dr. David Doty, who I believe has cracked the code on this. So that's another kind of element of the solution here.
All right, and when you say believe has cracked the code, I mean, this seems like it would be a pretty revolutionary concept here. Is this something that's ready to go to market?
No, it isn't. It's ready to build a prototype on, though. So what he wisely wants to do this thing on gradients that make sense. In other words, to say, okay, I want to take 200 megawatts of wind and turn that in through the synthetic process into fuel, and so give me the money to develop the plant to do that, is not going to happen. What is going to happen is this needs to be proved at the couple hundred kilowatt level, so which is the equivalent of about a barrel of fuel. Okay, so he wants to be able to say, okay, you give me 200 kilowatts of wind, and I'm going to turn that into a barrel a day of fuel, and you can watch me do it.
It seems like the holy grail of energy storage.
It is. It's certainly a good idea. I think that when we get to low-cost, highly energy-dense batteries, it'll be interesting. I think this will be necessary for things like jet aircraft and Class 8 trucks, which are going to be very difficult to electrify. But for passenger cars and e-bikes and scooters and so forth, I think that batteries are going to win the day.
All right. Well, Craig, we're going to end off here.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on, George.
This is George Alger with Craig Shields. I was just going to say 2 Green Energy. And signing off for today's segment of OurVentura.com. See you next time.